The Backrooms movie is specifically about power dynamics and the need to have power over someone else and control what other people do. I'm not going to beat around the bush with this one. If you haven't seen the Backrooms movie yet, do not watch this because this is going to contain every single spoiler ever. So go watch the movie and then come back and then we can yap because this is so worth it. This is a good movie. This is the movie of maybe the year. One of the most important insights that we get to Clark's character at the start of the movie is that actually his only friends are technically his employees. He doesn't talk about friends or family outside of people who he employs who are directly under a position of empower because he is their employer and they're the employees. And so there's a direct imbalance of power going on between him and the people who he deliberately decides to hang out with. When he's talking about his wife at the start of the movie, we see him freak out and get angry towards her. He has this type of rage built up in him and he's not willing to have the discussions about his wife because they anger him so much. One of the most important details that we get at this point in the movie is that the argument he had with his wife was about the way that he talked to her. He essentially tells her he pays for her degree, he pays for the house, he keeps the roof over her head as well. And essentially what he's doing here is he's really emphasizing the fact that he owns her, he owns that degree, he owns that house. In fact, that's something we hear him reiterate multiple times to his therapist, saying, "It was my house, I was kicked out of my house, it was never their house, it was never our house, it was my house," to him. And he owns this house and he sees himself as owning his wife too because he has that, again, position of power over her because he has the financial upper hand. He is responsible for paying for her degree. He is responsible for the house. He's the one with the money. And so she has no right to question him about his alcoholism or making a noise in the night because he owns her. He owns everything she has. This is such a pivotal point in understanding Clark's character because this is how he goes about the rest of the movie and it ultimately leads to the demise of every single character who we see die. When Clark can't convince the therapist, who is the only person who has power over him because he's desperate for her approval, for her to release him from his guilt and say, "Oh no, you didn't do anything wrong, it's just the way you're wired, you're not a bad person, your wife is crazy," but she won't say it and so she's the only person with power over him. I'm going to get around to that later, but when Clark can't convince her that the Backrooms exist, he gets the only people who he knows cannot say no to him, his employees. Because neither of these two can say no to him, they both get together, they both follow him despite how crazy and erratic he's sounding. They're probably very scared and worried that he's in a manic episode, but they can't say no because of the power imbalance. He again controls the finances here, so he controls their job and so he kind of controls them. When trying to explore the shaft in the kind of Backrooms, once they've gone through and obviously they're a little bit traumatized, he kind of knocks this off and kind of moves on with his plans because it's about him and it's about what Clark wants and not about them being traumatized by shifting realities. He sends his employee down the shaft on the rope instead of sending himself down. He does this specifically because he doesn't want to risk his own life, but he knows the employee cannot say no, and so he's the life that he risks, and essentially this character dies because of the power imbalance there. He couldn't say no to his boss. His boss had a position of authority. He listened to his boss and that's ultimately what killed him. Obviously, the second employee doesn't get a much better fate than this. When we first see her freaking out, we think Clark's going to comfort her, maybe help her, but we know from when his wife was distressed that isn't really the kind of character Clark is and it's not who he's interested in being. Clark repetitively refers to himself as an architect, and what do architects do if not control the environment around them, if not manipulate the actual physical space around them? We find out later that Clark's second employee has actually been murdered by him because she wouldn't play along with his game. She wouldn't play into the fantasy that he needed her to live. She wouldn't calm down and accept the version of reality he wanted. And because he felt like he was in the position of power there, he felt entitled to kill her. Her inability to mentally play along with his kind of power dynamics and accept the reality he wanted her to live really plays into the kind of slave-master dialectics that we see within philosophy, and him killing her is essentially his way of taking that away from her. She can't have autonomy. She can't have her own thoughts anymore. She's a dead body, and the way he stores her is actually even more perverted and possessive. Backrooms are these massive things, and there are so many rooms and empty kind of like shutters. There are so many places that he could have put her body, including the cupboard where he found the ID of the other man. However, Clark doesn't do this. He keeps the body of his employee and keeps it in the fridge where he lives. So not only now do we see him having power over her financially because she was employed with him, not only do we then see him having like power over her because he kind of understood the Backrooms when she didn't, not only does he then take her final power of resistance away from her by killing her, he now keeps her body with him. He controls it, he owns it, he decides where to store it, and he keeps it with him, again showing that aspect of possessiveness and needing to have power over something. When our our therapist protagonist finally gets there, she isn't greeted kindly. She isn't greeted with a thank you for coming to look for him. She's instead tied up and robbed of her autonomy. She's robbed of her ability to kind of run, be scared, react at all. She's tied up and kidnapped by him, again showing this need for control and this possessive desire to own things. What's really interesting here is we see him interacting with his still lives. What I think most people have missed to note about the still lives is the still wife of Clark's presumed wife is scared because we see her running away from Captain Clark later on. So we know that to some degree they have a level of awareness about what's happening around them, yet he treats them as if they're not aware at all, instead consuming them, and I mean literally eating them, and what could be a possession of power over something more than actually consuming it. Another really noteworthy fact here is one of the still lives is actually one that's presumed to be his wife. However, he doesn't treat her graciously. He doesn't treat her like a replica of something that he loves. He instead scalps her so that he can live out his fantasy exactly how it was supposed to end. There is no gentleness, there is no love, there is no compassion. And again, this still life has some autonomy. We see her scared of Captain Clark. Despite traumatizing his therapist, despite terrifying her, despite robbing her of autonomy and making her scared and fearful for her own life, she still has an element of power over him. And this is why I think the therapist character is actually really interesting here. Essentially, Clark's therapist is the only one who has power over him. When you step into a therapy session, you have a client and you have the therapist, and the therapist is in a position of authority because they understand psychology, they understand what's going on, and they're essentially working as a doctor in that moment. Because Clark is operating there as a patient, he's actually at the lower level of power here, which might explain why we don't see Clark killing the therapist. On top of the imbalance and the power imbalance that you already have in therapy, she also has something that he really needs, and that's acceptance of himself. He cannot truly accept himself, and that's why he hides in the back rooms, because there he can at least pretend to, and no one's going to call him out on it. However, his therapist can. Because she gets to understand human psychology, because she gets to see the real him, she's the only one who can excuse his behavior and say, it's not your fault, it's everyone else's fault. And then he regains the power that he needed all along to know that he was in the right and he was the one in control. But if he's not, that puts him at the power imbalance that he cannot stand. Fortunately, this ability to accept himself, to accept the bad parts of himself, to accept the violent parts of himself, to accept the drunken, alcoholic parts of himself is actually his demise, because the split second his therapist allows him this and the power imbalance shifts there, he accepts all the bad parts of him. And not long after accepting all the bad parts, we see Captain Clark devour him. This is such a pivotal point because Captain Clark represents essentially the bad version of him, the big, scary, aggressive version of him, the part that can be violent, the part that can be loud, the part that's, acting very drunk and out of character. It's a drunken mess who's terrifying to be around. Likely the version that his wife saw of him. However, the split second he decides to allow himself to be this character, it consumes him. The alcoholic version of Clark that's addicted to alcohol, the version of him that gets drunk, consumes the real Clark, and the alcoholic version of Clark takes over, gaining the power. Essentially, because he now has an excuse to be like this, the bad version of him becomes more powerful because it's no longer challenged, and because it becomes more powerful, it means the death of the real Clark. Every single character who dies in the Backrooms dies specifically because of a lack of power. Even at the beginning, when we see the found footage tape, we see them begging for someone to save them. However, whoever could save them doesn't try and save them because the experiment is more powerful than what could happen to the researcher in the found footage tapes. Clark controls his employees, and because they feel indebted to him as their boss, they both die because of this. Clark keeps one of the bodies because he feels possession over it. Clark enjoys the Backrooms because it's a reality that he can control that nobody else gets a say in. Clark is obsessed with becoming an architect and being an architect because it means he gets to manipulate and control the environment around him. Clark falls out with his wife because she challenges him on his drinking and he wants to be the one in charge. Clark needs the therapist to forgive him. Clark needs the therapist to tell him that he's okay because he needs that kind of approval to regain his power back. Everyone who dies in this movie dies because of Clark's need to be the most powerful, even Clark himself.
Just because you didn't get to be an architect.
I am a fucking architect! I am a fucking architect!
Yeah, I am an architect. I'm just not selling bad quality furniture.
I am a fucking architect! I am a fucking architect! I am
I'm a fucking architect. God damn it, one is simply stuck peddling this wretched, abominable furniture because
No one's really helping me, but that's all. I'll figure it out my own way.